Children's Services Council relies on qualitative and quantitative research to inform our decisions. From the Council's inception, the process employed has been to gather data in a combination of ways, using empirical method and grassroots conversations with an informed provider community, key community leadership, and consumers. Along with the research in hand, which all of you have a copy of, this morning's symposium is part of that process. We are very excited today because we've gathered all of you here to give you an introduction to the Childhood Connection, a strategic assessment of Martin County's future. We have a busy and full morning plan, but before we get started, I want to recognize a few of the community partners that made this strategic assessment possible. And I would just ask some of you to stand as I kind of introduce you. The whole Child Connection is on the front page of this. They certainly have been on the front page of this process throughout. And Nicole King in particular, I want to thank for her leadership, her vision, and her guidance. She's the one who brought this to us, to Jim Wojcik and I, and said, we need to do this. And I don't know where she is. Nicole's in the back, so thank you. The Business Development Board, Martin County in particular, Crystal Stiles, who saw that this was certainly something they would also be using and be useful to them in their future planning. I don't think Crystal's here. The Community Foundation of Palm Beach and Martin County, Daryl Houston's here. Daryl and Jillian Dukasich were certainly very supportive throughout the process. The Martin County Commission, Taryn Krista, the United Way, Jim Wojcik, and the Children's Services Council on our behalf, Sarah Gosney and Annette Sparling, who, with Nicole, worked through the document and the process from the very beginning for the last 18 months. So thank you all. I would also like to thank the members of the Children's Services Council Community Advisory Panel, and all of you who are members, please stand. This group was instrumental in the direction and organization of the data. They served as the steering committee and approved the document and made sure that we were continually on the right track. So please refer to the acknowledgments page and the first page of the document. You can see all the rest of the community partners, but thank you very much. Well, a year ago today, exactly a year ago, but approximately a year ago, our first Day of the Child Symposium was held, and we heard from Peter Gorski, Dr. Peter Gorski from Dade County. He provided us with a profile of the challenges and the opportunities facing our state and our community. We spent that morning framing desired results for our families and children. We also talked about establishing an effective accountability system for ensuring that our investments produce positive results. Today, we're going to continue that conversation from a more informed vantage point because we have in our hands a research document. Results. You've been provided a copy of the Childhood Connection document. We will have a chance to work with the data in it during the morning. We're fortunate to have multiple presenters with us today who can offer insight into the priority areas. But first, I want to introduce Bliss Brown, because she's going to have a conversation with us to kind of get us motivated and kick this all off. I met Bliss about 8 months ago, and since that introduction, each subsequent meeting with her has increased my admiration for her positive attitude, her insight, and her contagiously hopeful approach to community work. Bliss is president of Imagine Chicago, an organization she founded in 1992 to create economies in which nothing and no one is wasted. She's a graduate of Yale, Harvard, and the Kellogg School of Management. Bliss is a former corporate banking executive and past director of 16 nonprofit boards. More importantly, she's an educator, a mother, a priest, a global traveling author who we can now claim as a member of Martin County's residents. Please join me in welcoming David Stone.
Like Dave, I can't juggle that many things in my hand because I have to use this technology, which is terrible. Good morning. It's wonderful always to be in the company of people who care about children's lives. For those of you who are standing, there are 3 seats in the front row. If you would like to come and sit down before we would you like to come and sit before we begin? Otherwise, you could be standing a little while. I'm very glad to be standing here as a resident of Martin County. I moved here in 2011 to help take care of my ferociously independent and extremely old parents who live independently. You'll hear more about that shortly. But after living in Chicago for the last 50 years and doing community work on 6 continents, I can tell you that in my experience, Martin County is someplace really, really exceptional. I wasn't smart enough to move here for that reason. But I want to just tell you what I've noticed since I've come here. The first is the outstanding quality, intelligence, efficiency, and accountability of local government. I admit that coming from Cook County, I didn't have a high standard, but this is someplace unbelievable to me. I mean, government that works. In fact, I said recently to someone, the Elliott Museum in their Treasure Coast exhibit should do an exhibition on how Martin County got to have such a good local government. I mean, it's really something amazing. The second is the dedication and competence of the nonprofit professionals who live in this community. And really, it's a big round of applause. I've noticed, which is delightful, is I suppose because you're small enough, people do professional development by rotating organizations. And as a result of that, there's an enormous understanding of interdisciplinary needs. That's very special, and it's also exceptional in my view. Yes, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And it's not only a beautiful place, but there's a mentality in this county of stewarding what you have here. So the fact that there is a comprehensive and disciplined plan for growth, that there is intelligence about urban densities and service areas makes a huge difference in building confidence for those of us in our family who think 4 generations out, and knowing that this is going to continue to be a special place. Usually the weather is an asset. Compared to Chicago, no one ever moves to Chicago for the weather. People do move here for the weather. But there's also a very affordable and high-quality style of life available to a very wide range of people. I love going to restaurants here because you see everybody together in the same place. And finally, this county is of a size that collectively we can do whatever we set our mind to. We have the resources, we have the intelligence, we have the goodwill. So this could be the county known as the place that every child thrives. Not many places could say that, but this could be that place. The single most impressive and heartening thing to me about Martin County from the beginning was discovering that there was a Children's Services Council. And I'm not only commending the staff, which I couldn't be more impressed by. I told my sister the first time I came away from a meeting here, I said, they're so good, they're intimidating. I feel like I shouldn't be in the room. But what's really impressive is that, and it's extraordinary, that Martin County voters of their own free will, have for 25 years had the foresight and intelligence to recognize that investing in children, I am of a certain age, and creating a dedicated funding source for children's programs is the best investment in the future that you can make. And I can say unequivocally that it is the first time in my whole life, and I'm 62, that I've ever felt happy to pay my taxes. All the research that Dr. Gorski shared with you here last year showed why investing in children pays such exceptional dividends and why not investing produces such exceptional costs down the line. Oh yes, well, this is why you really don't want me with a thing like this. Dr. Gorski shared many helpful things that the national research shows about why we can't afford to wait to invest in our children, as well as what influences contribute most to the positive or negative trajectory of their life course. Some of his more sobering insights to me, I wasn't here, but I read through his presentation. Some of the more sobering insights included that children left behind by kindergarten rarely catch up, that persistent stress changes brain architecture. It's not just a bad day, it becomes a bad life. That poverty and racism sicken and reinforce racial disparities, and that adverse childhood experiences persist into adulthood and manifest themselves in very serious adult health challenges like heart disease and depression and substance abuse. As you'll see shortly from the data, while we're doing pretty well in Martin County overall, there are still children left behind here, and parents whose stress is increasing, in some cases almost exponentially, by the continued downturn which has affected those at the bottom floor. And our children are suffering poor health outcomes that will follow them into adulthood. Ronald Marston, a philosopher, once said that justice is fundamentally a matter of who is included and whom we can tolerate neglecting. Can we imagine a county in which not a single child is left behind and set that as a standard? What would it take and what would we need to do? Each of you has a wealth of experience to share about that. And Dr. Gorski also suggested from his perspective that what it takes is to target the whole community, recognizing that the health of any of us depends on the health of all of us, to be clear about our vision for children's well-being and the strategic goals that support it, and to work as leaders to ensure the participation of multiple sectors, meaning education, health, childcare, family support, the people who are in this room, at multiple levels, national, state, community. And there's always, I know, a huge issue of alignment. That's a whole other thing. But in a way which is also evidence-based and informed by data that catalyzes systems improvement in education. So the point is to always be better than we were, based on what we now understand. And also to ask the questions about what we don't know in a way that unlocks the collective intelligence in the system. We're headed into all of that today, focusing on the well-being of the whole county, looking at research, clarifying the strategic goals, and also, importantly, working as collaborators to identify and begin to organize the most important and urgent emerging issues. But before we do that, I also just want to refresh your memory of the way Dr. Gorski concluded his talk by reminding us of that which we know very well, that it's relationships that are the primary influence on children's health, growth, and development. He ended in a very touching way, quite literally a touching way, with a simple sentence that all children need and deserve to feel connected, to feel valued, to feel that they can make a difference, and that requires patience and persistence. Which brings us to the childhood connection. I've entitled my own remarks, "The Future in Our Hands." And I wish you would get out your folder and make sure that you have a copy of that childhood connection assessment within reach. It's this gorgeous 4-color print document, which you will see as an absolute treasure trove of information. But before we do that, just have it ready, because we're going to use it in just a minute. But before that, what I'd like you to do is take a look at your own hands. Just look at them. You know, I love hands because they're the primary way we have of engaging with the world. I discovered the Sheriff's Department in Martin County has informed me that I have no fingerprints. And the reason, I don't have a criminal past that I know of, but I do have many, many decades of being a gardener. And boy, you know, the fire ants are a problem here, because when I garden, I don't want my hands in gloves. And years of gardening have worn off my fingerprints. Some of you, I imagine, have hands that are rough. Some probably were born and sort of like big paws on a dog. Your mother said, he will play basketball, or she will play piano, or whatever it is. You know, this is the way that we engage with the world. And what I'd love for you to do is to think back, even to honor in your mind, the very first people who held your hand. And the people who, as a child, you got to hold hands with when you didn't feel safe. Who held on to you? Who held on to you? Because the people in the room today, all of you are here because you're leaders. No one gets to be a leader except because we were surrounded by people in our life, our grandmothers, our teachers, who held on to us, who held on to the promise of our lives and didn't let us go. No matter how hard it got, no matter how bad we got, no matter how confused we were, they held us. And they even held us when we succeeded and were obnoxious about it. They held us. They held on to us. Now, feel the difference in your hands when they're open and when they're closed. Just feel the difference in that. Remind yourself of what it feels like when you're stressed, or when you're angry, or when you feel like you need to protect yourself. Our hands are the first indicator of how we are. And by the same token, what it feels like when you're making a sandcastle, or touching someone tenderly, or holding someone's hand that you really love. Fortunately, we were all children once. Some of us still are. And we carry that memory and imprint in us, for better or worse, as Dr. Gorski pointed out. So we understand clearly what children need: a healthy start, a nurturing and supportive family, a safe and strong community, opportunities to learn and to succeed. And it's really our privilege to be able to hold children now in that way ourselves, and to encourage others to do so too. Because their future is in our hands, and this is why we're here today. But how do we know what Martin County's children need most right now, so that we can figure out how to organize our commitment to them in the most effective way that really gives them what they need in particular and not in general. And now you can take in your hands those wonderful hands, those touch imprinted hands, take in your hands this really quite good childhood connection report. This is a tool, and it's a tool that we can use to know how our kids are doing in Martin County, what's working, what needs work, what's on the horizon. It's a research-driven document which can inform strategic decision-making, and like any tool in our hands, its effectiveness depends on how we use it. So in a few minutes, you're going to hear from 4 well-known to you and very seasoned presenters about each of the key goals set out in this report. Not surprisingly, they're children's health and staying on track as a healthy child, strong and nurturing families, safe and stable communities, and success in school. And in each case with the presenters, you'll hear how we're doing. You'll see the report card for Martin County. You'll hear what the goal is. You'll hear what the emerging issues are. And they'll also bring it home to you in some way which is clear and memorable so that you can keep it in your own mind. What we know, and it says it here clearly on page 2, is that in order to get done what we know we need to do requires 4 things. And it's a commitment that it requires of us to commit to results, meaning we don't only want it, we can't live without it. To commit to collaboration, meaning there's no prize for working alone. Because these issues are too big. They're too big, we can't get them done on our own, and they all lead together. To commit to investing ourselves into educating the public. Because I love working in Africa, because there people come to meetings by the thousands because they say, this is a meeting where they have the knowledge. And everyone brings their sisters and cousins and families to get the knowledge. The people in this room have the knowledge. And so it's a matter of sharing it so that everybody knows what the research says and why this matters. And then to commit to research. And there's a humility in research. It says, we know stuff, and there's also stuff we don't know. And we don't understand. And so we also need to be very intelligent about the questions we ask. Let's see, I probably complete this. That was the last one. So there you have the call to action. And answering this call is exciting, not only because children need to feel valued and connected and make a difference, but we do too. Human beings have enormous creative capacity, and it gets unlocked in relationship to ideas, and relationship to other people. While we don't often reflect on it, we've invented every system and every language out of which we see and act. And the good news about that is that even though some have developed so much authority and sheer weight over time, so that it feels like this is the only way to do things, no community is ever fixed. It's always governed by the choices and the actions of the people and organizations that live there. Meaning any system we've invented, we can also reinvent. The adaptive challenge, and an adaptive challenge is one where you say, we've never been here before, so no one quite knows what to do. The adaptive challenge here in Martin County, as in all human systems, is to create the context in which both the way we speak and the way we act mobilizes resources, enables learning. I would even say accelerates learning. We're better, smarter together than we are alone. And helps people really use their innate capacity to recreate systems in a more life-giving direction. I can testify, I know, from 20 years of doing work all over the world, that new and better possibilities are created by discovering and connecting the hope, the experience, the imagination, and the resources that reside within every individual, every institution, every community in productive ways around goals that really matter. The childhood connection sets before us those 4 large worthy goals. And they are in goals that are impossible for us to realize working independently. So we have to think and organize as a whole. So how will we realize that the future our children deserve and depend upon us to deliver is one that we can deliver? And I would say here that one clue to that, and this will sound sexist because I'm female, but I would say that one clue to that is thinking like a mother. Sarah Ruddick wrote a wonderful book a few years back called Maternal Thinking, I think it's the subtitle, Toward a Politics of Peace, in which she defines motherhood. And by the way, for you men, she says, motherhood is not the person who got to give birth, it's the one who takes up this mantle. Because motherhood is a sustained response to the promise embedded in the creation of new life. I love that definition because what it draws our attention to is to say the first thing is keeping in mind the promise that our children's lives represent. To say it even more fundamentally, it's keeping life in mind in the presence of death. It's staying focused on life in the presence of everything which threatens it. And the second piece of it is it's about creating the enabling structures that sustain that promise to the very end. That sustains that promise. Good mothers, and good fathers too, but I can't speak for good fathers because I've only been a mother. Good mothers think about their families as a whole, without losing track of the particular needs and gifts of individual family members. And on a daily basis, they manage somehow, and it's a managing against the odds, to balance individual desire and community good while staying focused on the promise of their child's life over time. And whether women or men, that is the challenge, to realize the promise of every child's life and to create the structures that sustain that promise for their lifetime. All parents know well, it's amazing anyone signs up for this job actually, all parents know well the hope, the imagination, the discipline, the flexibility, the clarity about values, the patience, the hard work, the sheer stamina it takes to stay attentive to a future that is always changing, that is always emerging. And to do so in a way that doesn't rob you of your own hope either. Because when you lose hope, as we see with depressed parents, it takes the toll on the child. So, like mothers and fathers, the question then for me becomes what conscious daily choices we make here to realize the promise of children's lives and how we stay alert, conscious, responsive, in dialogue with the future that's emerging. 20 years ago in Chicago, a very big dream seized control of me, activated by a very deep grief. The deep grief was that the Chicago Tribune, our local big paper, ran a series one year in which every day a child under 16 lost their life in an act of violence. They ran a feature story on the child and his or her family. It was called Killing Our Children, and it was it still breaks my heart. It was every day. And I was a mother of young children, and I simply couldn't stand it anymore. And I said, what is going on here? How is it possible? How is it possible that children at the very age that they have the most energy, the most vision, the most commitment, the most to give, are drinking themselves to death and killing each other. What is happening here? And it occurred to me that it was a very simple thing. Kids didn't think they had a viable future. And boy, when they didn't have a viable future, life got cheap. Their life and everybody's life around them. There are not enough police and prisons to protect against that. So I really began to think about where that was coming from. And one of the things that was certainly the case was that it was emerging out of a divided imagination. We simply couldn't think from the whole. And the cost of not thinking from the whole was these kids' lives. So I really began to talk and to dream and to think about what really could awaken the hope and devotion, because that's really the right word, the devotion, to a transforming future for, in that case, Chicago, where no child would die young, and where young people could live into the full promise of their lives. And the hunger for hope and wholeness that really manifests led me to set aside my 16-year corporate banking career really to try to live into that hope. The result was Imagine Chicago, and I don't have time to talk about that really at all today. But it's led to a global movement on 6 continents. And at the heart of that movement is simply inspired action working together against the odds across division. It's simply that. That's it. And there is, at the heart of it, a sensibility and a practice, which is a very simple practice that I would like to share. And probably slides behind. Yeah. Oh, there it is. Surprising. So, in this, your nomenclature is evidence. This is not normally in my nomenclature, but it's important to speak the local language. So, think of this as a way of moving from evidence to action. And it's in 3 simple words: understand, imagine, create. I'd like to say a word about each of those. In every initiative, and Imagine Chicago has created more than 100 partnerships around the world. As a tiny, itsy David and Goliath, teensy tiny nonprofit organization. But every time we begin by seeking to understand what is. And doing it in a particular way, which is to ask and teach others to ask open-ended, value-oriented questions that evoke the stories about what's working, what matters, what's important. The focus is always on sharing and best practices, articulating strengths, and creating mental maps of those values and strengths on which the new possibilities can be built. You can think of it in a simple way. If I say to you, no matter how sad you think many partnerships may have been in your life, if I say, tell me the story of the best partnership you were ever in. What worked? How did it work? What did you learn? How did you work as a partner? Everyone's energy for partnership goes up in the process. And that's a very real set of stories. It's also a map of what is going on inside of you that says, against all of my other experience, I am coming to this meeting. Why? Because once, even if it was the positive deviation, you were in that partnership where something amazing happened. And we know that, and we carry it in us. When you begin to share that, and as Peter Drucker says, it's possible to align strengths in a way that weaknesses don't matter. When you share that, you then move into the domain of imagination, and imagination is hardwired into us. And you know, one thing I love with this when you're working with kids is it's the domain of freedom. In your imagination, nobody tells you what to do. And everything can be different. So when we hear a story, if you tell me your amazing story and you hear my amazing story, without being able to resist it, our minds connect those stories and say, wow, if that was possible, which I didn't live, and this was possible, which I did live, a lot more is possible now. I can see it. I can see that we can get this done. And, you know, as Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, a mind once stretched by a new idea never regains its original dimensions. And that happens naturally. So, you know, if you ask a group of parents, even if they're teenage parents, what's the very best thing you did for your child this week? In a teenage parenting group, and everyone hears every one of those things. Every young mother in the group says, I could try that. You know, she's 16 too, and she did that. You know, and then you move to create. And for imagination to make change happen, then it has to be embodied in something concrete and practical, some visible outcome around which people can organize. And then you're into, you know, the roles and responsibilities, all of that. So, you know, if you think about this in the context we're in here, we say, you know, to understand, what do we need to know? What does the research and experience show that children need? Where are we now? You know, what's working? How is it working? Why is it working? What are the conditions contributing to it? You can unpack all of those things, and it's important to know what works. You can be in a community with an 80% unemployment rate, but 20% of the people there are working and living there. And finding out how they got a path to work gives you a lot of information about what can happen for the rest of the people who live there. Then, what creative opportunities do we now see that can make a difference? You know, where did your imagination go? You know, our capacity to aspire, to dream, to care, to do things that matter is, again, hardwired into us. That's a great thing. We need meaning. We need meaning. That's a really important and useful thing for the kind of work that we want to do. And when you start talking in the imagined terms, not only individually but also collectively, what do we as a county, what do we as a county need to do? What do we as a county know that we can work on together? We can think imaginatively, collectively, as well as individually. And then, you know, who will do it, and how, and when, and, you know, what are the rules, and what are the indicators, and how do we measure success for our partners? So, that, you might think, that sounds so simple. Well, yes, it is, and it's also not inevitable. And this is one of the reasons it's not inevitable. This comes out of the editor of the Journal of Future Studies, and I love this little graphic called Futures Triangle. He says when we look at the future, there are all kinds of things that push us into the future, things out of our control that make the future different. The computer chip gets invented or the tsunami hits, one is positive, one negative, but in each case the future is now different. There are also all the things that keep us doing things the way we've always done. It's the weight of the present arrangements. It's past investments. It's the fact that your computer still has to be amortized over 3 years, so you're not buying it even if it doesn't work, you know. And then there's the pull. And the pull, that's the domain of inspiration, of goals, of what we want, of what we would do whether we were paid to do it or not. This matters. When we look at what it is we need to do, it's also useful to have the conversation about the rest of it, because those counterweights will get in the way. They're not personality driven, they are part of the understanding what is. You know, we have made investments in the past, we are used to seeing in a certain way, and just to be able to say, this is what we really want, here are some of the things that can keep us from getting there. But this is why, this is what I can see, and this is why it matters. And at the heart of then moving there, and this is a, don't worry about all the stuff, just look at the bottom. What's foundational here is effective communication. Anyone who knows me in this room knows that I could go on for the next 6 weeks about this. And in fact, in Hope Sound in the fall, I am. But that effective communication, what does this mean? It means talking to each other and asking questions in a way that always builds something. The reason that's important is because each of us is constituted in the moment as someone new. You know, you leave today a different person than you came. And you, I mean, if you think in a simple way, when someone says, what happened to your hair? You know, you like, even though you say, I don't care, you go look in the mirror. You know, because because someone has just created, or if someone says to you, you know, let me give you some feedback. The problem with you is, what happens? I mean, we go like this. We're hardwired to go like that. We know when we're under threat. Whereas if someone, you know, I usually look at the hands, look at the hand. Talk to the hand. But, you know, when we're communicated, when we're listened to, when people ask us questions that we appreciate being asked, that go to what matters, that do it in a way that brings out the best in us, that shifts things. We become capable of being more. That's also true for children, that they need positive information in order to know the way in which to go. If you say to your child, don't throw your coat on the floor, you have inadvertently programmed a relationship between coat and floor. If you say, please put your coat on the hook, because then it can stay dry and we'll have more room to play, the child knows what to do. And we're the same way. So how do you then deal with the resistances? Well, you can always, when people say, oh, but that's not going to happen, you can say, so you say, we'll never get that funded. So what I'm hearing is, where do we find the money? Because funding is important to this process. But if this is what we want, it's always possible to mobilize any conversation in the direction of what you want, how to get there, and what it looks like when you arrive. Again, a whole workshop on that topic. I'm going to end with a very personal slide. You are now looking at the person that held my hand, and I know I will not be able to get through this without crying. My father turns 102. In October, he is headed to Europe in 3 weeks. He just got back from Burma. Those are 2 of his great-grandchildren photographed this year. They are separated by 99 years. Every dime of his estate when he dies will go to the education of his great-grandchildren. Not his children, not his grandchildren, his great-grandchildren. Because from the moment, by some grace, that my father arrived on earth, he has always thought about the 3rd and 4th and 5th and 6th generation. He says, I would never want to give anything to my kids and grandchildren, because if I did a good job of raising them, they can take care of themselves. What you want to worry about is the last generation. And he said, you know, there's a great thing which I can say with pride, which is my children are a lot smarter than I am, and their children are a lot smarter than they are, and the great-grandchildren, well, we're going to all have to step aside. But you know what? That's the way it should be. So when I think about patience, about persistence, it's not only about doing things for kids today that make their lives better. It's about doing things today for these kids that ensures that their great-grandchildren look that happy. She was born at 27 weeks. It took hundreds of hands to keep her alive. His father was a Korean orphan who is legally blind, a graduate of Stanford. His mother is a hemiplegic who is paralyzed on one side. Neither can drive. That is the brightest great-grandchild in the family. When you think of the number of hands that invested in those parents' lives to produce that child and his curiosity, that is, for me, emblematic of the challenge that we have set before us. Thank you. Oh, you should flip the last slide. This is the call to action.
Well, I hope you feel better about the work we all do.